Welcome to the Free Range Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Livermore. This episode is sponsored by the Program on Law, Communities, and the Environment at the University of Virginia School of Law. With me today is Frances Moore, a professor of environmental science and policy at UC Davis. Her work focuses on climate economics, and she was the lead author of a recent paper in Nature that examined an important set of feedbacks between politics and the climate system. Hi, Fran. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's talk about this super interesting new paper that you published. Here's a great line from the beginning of it. I'll just read it out. And the quote is, "Climate policy and greenhouse gas emissions arise endogenously from the coupled interaction of the climate, social, political, and energy systems." So there's a lot of important stuff in there. Maybe you could help unpack it a little bit for our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of long words in there, but I think you have picked out like pretty much the key sentence kind of describing what's new in this paper and what we're trying to do. And the, kind of recognizing that existing modeling by and large in the climate space kind of takes emissions as a given, right? So we're either asking, what will the climate system do given, this emissions pathway or this other emissions pathway, right? Or we're taking these emissions and we're saying, give me the lowest cost energy mix that, meets this some emissions constraint, right? That can get us to this, say 2 degrees kind of consistent pathway. And what both of those approaches do is they just say okay, well, this is emissions X or it's emissions Y. And what we're trying to do here is we're actually trying to model the determinants of those emissions pathways. And so, this is a key question in what climate change is going to look like over the 21st century is what happens to emissions. And right now, by and large, we kind of don't put probabilities over those emissions because mostly we don't incorporate them into our models. And so that's what this paper is trying to do. So when it says endogenously, it means as part of our model, we don't impose emissions from outside of the model. Instead, what we do is we model the formation of policy and emissions, and that then links into the climate system. And then there are feedbacks to more policy and changes in emissions and so on as part of the model. And so that's kind of what the key difference is in this paper compared to kind of what most of the literature does.
Yeah, great. And so one thing that is, I've always found interesting about the research in this area is there's kind of a split between two broad ways of modeling kind of the climate, economy, energy systems. And there's one that is very prevalent in, the IPCC process and amongst climate scientists. And that's where kind of what you were saying is, let's look at, what happens to the world on a particular emissions pathways. And, there's different kind of scenarios. And that's kind of about modeling how the climate system responds to what we're doing in terms of emissions. Or as you said, what energy mix is consistent with different emissions pathways. And that's kind of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the folks that put out the regular assessment reports, the big scientific process. And there's a whole world of researchers and modelers who kind of feed their work into that. And then there's another world, which is the economists' way of doing climate modeling. And that's like your William Nordhaus, who won a Nobel Prize in economics a few years ago for his work developing the first big economy climate model. And these are the models that feed into a different important policy process, right? This is the social cost of carbon that's developed by the U.S. government that is used to price the value of emissions reductions when the federal government in some states now use this number 2 when they're evaluating policy using cost-benefit analysis. So how does the model that you've developed fit into these, two broad categories of the kind of IPCC versus SCC approach to doing modeling of climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I've done work previously using the kind of the SCC type models, some of my work uses versions of DICE and some of the other, which is the Bill Nordhaus model, and some other models that also do that. This is distinct, I think, from both of those approaches. It is similar to the kind of economist world in that, in the economist world, you have emissions arise to some extent endogenously because policy enters into the model as a control variable, right? So one of the reasons economists design, and use the models they do is because they ask this question about what does optimal climate policy look like, and using these models where you're looking both at the cost of emissions reduction and the benefits in terms of reduced climate change damages, you can have this objective function that then you maximize that the welfare by controlling emissions at a certain rate over time, and that's what DICE does. We are distinct from that in that we are not optimizing anything. So although kind of cost of mitigation enter into the model, there's no kind of centralized, social planner the way there is in the DICE model, who kind of is this like omnipotent person who can just like control the carbon price, the global carbon price every period, which we kind of know doesn't exist. So what we're trying to do is our representation of how policy arises is a kind of more grounded than that. And because of that, it's like certainly not non-optimal. And so these carbon prices that come out of it are not necessarily optimal in any way, but they're just kind of coming through how we think, say, political processes work, basically.
Yeah, great. And I think that, one way that I think of the work that you've done here and published and the research behind it is, in some sense, as you said, it's a third approach, or it's at the intersection of these two different approaches, because as you note, just to reiterate, the Nordhaus and the economic kind of approach to doing this modeling is an optimization modeling, right? What's the ideal carbon price kind of question is what they're asking. And the IPCC world is doing a more predictive enterprise. What happens if we take this emissions pathway or that emissions pathway? And in some sense, it's really interesting what you've accomplished here, which is to say kind of a fully predictive model, in the sense that what's the most likely kind of suite of policies that we'll see in light of what we know about how policy is made, or at least how much of that we can capture in our models. And then how do those policies interact with emissions pathways? And then, and this is an important move in the paper, how do the emissions pathways then interact with the climate system to feed back into the political processes to generate different policies that then affect emissions and so on. And so it's really quite a complete way of making predictions about what our climate future looks like. It's really fun and interesting in that way. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that feedback effect that you now have been able to capture in your model, where maybe just taking a step back, feedbacks in the climate system we all know about. This is where when you add carbon into the atmosphere, that could heat up, that will heat up the planet, which then could do things like melt permafrost, which then releases methane, which heats up the planet. And, that's a positive feedback effect. But one of the feedbacks that you're interested in is the feedback where effects in the climate system then introduce changes into the political system. So what are some of those feedbacks that you're interested in?
Yeah. So just to respond to some of the things you said there. So I think certainly it's comprehensive in its ambition, I would say, this model. The question of whether or not we are it's also highly, highly stylized. And so I think there's because the ambition is to be comprehensive, there are pieces missing, and that people approaching this problem from different areas might kind of object to some of the simplifications we have to make, and there's always kind of more we can do on that space. I think it's also worth just spending a minute on why this is something we want to do, and this is not necessarily always obvious. And so I think for me, this question of putting probabilities over different emission scenarios is really important if you approach the problem as an adaptation planner, right? But the fact that right now we essentially don't do that at all, and we say, there's no way we can tell someone about whether RCP 8.5, a very high emission scenario, is less likely or more likely than RCP 4.5 or RCP 2.6. Like, I think that's just very impractical for, people trying to plan for what climate change impacts are going to look like over the next 50 years. And I think we kind of want to do a better job of that. And if you do, then you have to start saying something about what emissions trajectories are more or less likely. And there are other ways of doing it, but this is kind of one way of doing it. But then to get at your question, so what we're trying to do here, the reason we have a lot of feedback processes is to kind of respect the fact that there is a lot of potential non-linearities in the system, and that we can represent them in terms of these feedback processes that lead to, when you couple together a lot of different feedback, you can get quite complex kind of emergent dynamics out of a model. And so we really paid attention to evidence for these different types of feedbacks when we were looking into the relevant literatures. And we tried to capture kind of as many as we possibly could in designing the model, so that although it's highly abstract and stylized, it hopefully represents a lot of some of these key processes that are going to kind of affect the dynamics of these trajectories over time. And so some of the examples, you mentioned the feedback from the climate system kind of back into the social system. And so this is a overarching feedback that goes across the whole model, and we call it the cognition feedback. And so this is the idea that, maybe people perceive climate change, and, their perception of climate change maybe leads them, and this is something we vary in the model, but maybe that perception of climate change leads them to kind of either support climate policy or undertake kind of pro-climate, like individual behaviors. And so that's one of the big feedbacks that we allow for. And then we allow for various types of like imperfect cognition as supported by the that piece of the psychology literature. There are other important feedbacks some of your listeners may be familiar with, like in the energy system, for example, the feedbacks associated with cost declines over time. So kind of new energy technologies are often very expensive, but then as you kind of deploy more of them, the costs come down, which means you deploy more of them, which means costs come down. And this is this reinforcing feedback that's quite well documented in the kind of energy systems literature. And so like that's one of the feedbacks we have. There's I think altogether about 7 or 8 of these different types of feedbacks.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff there, and maybe at some point, if we have time, we can get back to. I think there's a kind of a fun and interesting philosophical question actually at the heart of your approach about kind of modeling human behavior in this causal way and making predictions. I think it's pretty interesting. Actually, deep kind of. Philosophical differences between the Nordhaus, the IPCC, and your approach, but just maybe to stay with in the weeds of the model for a second before we zoom way out. So I took a look at just the different feedback processes that struck me in the paper were, this notion of social conformity, right? The idea that if a bunch of people get together and start really caring about climate change and showing that and there's a norm that develops around addressing climate change, that could have potential tipping point effects. And we have experience with that maybe with smoking, where a norm develops around, say, smoking indoors, and then there's kind of a tipping point where it used to be if you didn't let people smoke in your apartment, you were kind of a big jerk. And now it's pretty strange if someone lights up in your house without asking. You noted the climate change perception, right? Is that as we start to see climate change happening in our environment, then that might lead people to care more about climate change, recognize it. Political interest is another one that you noted. The one that, as a law professor, that struck me interesting as the expressive force of law feedback. I don't normally see that in scientific papers, so maybe that's something we can talk about a little bit. And then another important one is the temperature emissions feedback, where if you have temperature change that then leads to a reduction in economic growth, that's then going to affect emissions. So all of these are really interesting on their own, and and could be, and we could spend a lot of time talking about them. Maybe we could talk a little bit about. I'm just thinking. Well, actually, why don't you tell me what's your favorite feedback?
Given I'm talking to a law professor here, it would be really interesting to talk about this expressive force of law piece of it. I think because that's an example where some of the challenges we had was reading some of this literature, and the law literature was some, and the psychology literature to some extent, and politically, really importantly, the political science literature, where you have documented feedbacks that are clearly important to the system, but they're very qualitative. They tend to be very qualitative descriptions. And what we have to do in this model is, it's a computational model, so you have to kind of take that and you have to try and turn it into functions and numbers in some way, so you can plug that idea in to your modeling of the system. And certainly that expressive force of law was really kind of interesting when I kind of learned about this idea. And it was clearly an important potential feedback, right? If you have signaling power from changes in the law that feeds back to public opinion in this reinforcing feedback loop, then that's going to be quite important in changing the dynamics, potentially changing the dynamics of the system. And so we wanted to incorporate that in a way that, drawing on this literature for support, but again, very qualitative literature, mostly with some case studies maybe. But we kind of, we wanted to be comprehensive in terms of the potential pathways that we were including there.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I'll kind of offer two somewhat contradictory takes on that. So one is, I think it's great. And it is, you're right that it's a very interesting potential feedback, could be important. There are lots of my colleagues in the legal academy who are interested in the idea of this expressive force of law, or sometimes kind of think of it as using law as a mechanism to achieve kind of cultural change, rather than just changing, incentives or something like that. So. My own personal take on this is that I'm a bit of a skeptic. There's kind of two different takes on expressive, the kind of expression in law. So one is just more kind of moral, that it's really irrespective of how the law affects people's attitudes or beliefs or preferences, that the law should respect equality or something like that, embody respect for gender equality or racial equality or something like that. That would be one. That's more of a kind of a moral view. And then an alternative would be the social scientific or the behavioral view would be, when you have a judicial opinion like Brown versus the board or Obergefell, which was the gay marriage opinion, then that affects how people view things like racial equality or, marriage equality or whatever. I think there's just a big open question on how much that works, how much that's real. As you might imagine, it's completely endogenous, right? So there's other social forces that are acting on the court and that are acting on politics and are acting on culture that, those social dynamics could be leading to broader social change and leading to the judicial opinions, right? And it's super hard to basically super hard / impossible to disentangle those. You'd have to imagine the experiment, right? You'd have to somehow, have some kind of exogenous shock that led to these kinds of legal changes. And then you have to trace, imagine, again, it's just a theoretical kind of study that you would do. So I think that there are just different views about that. I'm probably more on the skeptical side, on the behavioral side. I think on the moral side, that's a different question. But on the behavioral side, I'm somewhat more skeptical. It's possible. It's just very hard to know. That's the kind of thing. There's almost no way to empirically know anything. So it's kind of based on people's views, or you can do things like you can run experiments or surveys. I've seen some of this where you kind of inform someone of a hypothetical, or you just prime someone, letting them know that there's this judicial opinion that says this, and then you do an A/B testing kind of thing where you expose some people to the judicial opinion and not others, and you see how that, you see if that has any effect on their views. I think the out of that literature, again, it's a bit of a mixed story. I've actually seen some work that shows that there are reverse effects, right? Like, for example, like an interesting one would be, I don't actually know if this has been studied specifically, but you could do this, would be, is waterboarding torture would be a question. And you could say, expose people to a hypothetical judicial opinion that says that it's yes, and see what the effects are. But again, I just, I think out of the literature, what you get is very, very mixed. And again, sometimes even inverted. So like Roe v. Wade, for example, is
yeah,
kind
I
of
was just going to say
yeah.
Roe v. Wade, I think, is the classic example of like the feedback operating in the opposite direction,
Right,
potentially.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly, where it was actually pretty uncontroversial, the decision at the time, and then it just kind of became more and more and more controversial. Not more and more and more, but it did, and then stabilized into kind of the current level. So, but I do think it's the kind of thing and this actually is very interesting. This gets us into models in general and how to read the results of a model like the one that you have. It's a very useful thing to have in there because it's a possible pathway. And if someone believes that the expressive force of law is a real and important phenomenon, which they totally can, based on current evidence, it's just it's just what's your model of human behavior and how it interacts with legal institutions. Then, they can look at, in theory, you can imagine. You can kind of press that dial or not press that dial, right? Do you think it's important or do you not think it's important? Or look at the model runs where expressive force of law is a major factor. You've turned the dial up, or look at the model runs where that's low on the, where you've turned the dial down. And then, that can tell you something about, if it's a real thing, how important it is, right? And so I think that even irrespective of the kind of current state of affairs in terms of the empirics, there's value in modeling something like that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, the approach we took is that, we allow for this feedback and then, it could have a value of 0, and it does in some runs. And then, just the fact that it's a feedback process, which is what that by itself creates these empirical challenges that you were talking about, where everything's connected to everything else, right? So if you're looking at the real world, like how do you say what's the causal effect of this feedback versus not? Well, it's really hard, right? Because, the original policy itself, like, arises endogenously, like, from the society that's producing that policy, right? But then it potentially feeds back in some way on that society. And so, this modeling approach allows for a lot of, like, hypotheses around what, like, human behavior and cognition and social interactions and how they aggregate up to produce policy. It allows for you to put in a lot of different models of how that works and to kind of like look at how that affects emissions. And I think we don't necessarily take strong positions either way on like exactly what the magnitude of some of these feedbacks are. We have, but what we're trying to do is, to the best we can, kind of integrate across the evidence, allowing for a lot of these interacting dynamics and say something hopefully comprehensive about what the emissions pathways look and what factors are important in driving those emissions.
Right.
So if you look at this parameter, say the feedback, for example, and you decide, oh, you know what, like it turned out it doesn't seem that important after all, well, maybe we don't need to spend a lot more of like empirical effort if we're, if we're only interested in climate change, which obviously we're not. It's interesting for other reasons, but we might focus our efforts on kind of other parameters that drop out as being really important in differentiating these pathways.
Right. Yeah, no, it's all, super, super useful. And kind of the purpose of modeling exercises like this. One of the outputs or conclusions, or at least tentative conclusions that you guys come to, I think that's pretty interesting, kind of had to do with the effect of individual behavior. I don't think this is maybe all that surprising for at least some folks who follow this conversation closely, but it looks as though basically individual behavior can matter, but only kind of when it leads to broad preference cascades of some kind, right? Like where my behavior then affects someone else's behavior that then affects someone else's behavior. And then we reach a tipping point and norms change, and that leads into, feeds into the political system and everything else. So it's by myself, I'm not going to be able to accomplish much. And so the real question is, kind of how much does our individual behavior or the behavior of individuals who are concerned about climate change actually affect the behavior of other people. So was that a fair conclusion to come up with? And I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, that question about individual behavior, I think that was a part of, we have a quite rich representation of individual behavior change in the model, and partly that reflects where some of the effort has been, I think, on the scientific side around modeling kind of what affects kind of individual decisions to do kind of pro-environmental behavior. There's a lot of work on that we try and kind of incorporate in. But there's this tension, I think, and you saw these debates playing out, I think, in some of the popular kind of articles and things about the focus on individual behavior change versus on some kind of collective action. And what we do here is I think we're able a little bit to kind of resolve some of those arguments at those debates at a higher level, in the sense that we find, and this is not surprising, right? Just individual behavior change, by itself, it's that cannot solve climate change, right? Because most of how we produce emissions is collective it's a collective decision. And so, people making changes are only able to do so much to actual emissions. But because we have a lot of these reinforcing feedbacks in the model that are all coupled together, it is possible to put the model into certain states where the propensity of individuals that support collective climate policy to kind of make costly changes in their own behavior has a feedback to their neighbors, to their social network, that persuades other people of that same opinion, that we should do something at the collective level to address climate change. That has an effect then on the political system. And because there's all these coupled, connected, reinforcing feedbacks, that can create this kind of cascade of action that can lead to kind of a tipping point. And I think focusing on that piece of it, that what you're doing there is a social signal. It's not necessarily the emissions reductions themselves, but it's that social signal of, I am about your values, right? And it's kind of saying, look, I am undertaking this action that's costly to me because I care about climate change for the following reasons, right? And I think other people should too. And it's that effect that can potentially kind of leverage those individual actions into kind of much more large scale changes. And so we kind of show that the model has this potential in it. Once we parameterize the model to look at something more, what we think might be a more realistic set of parameters, it turns out that those states of the model where individual action is really key in tipping the whole system into this sustainable state is actually quite it's not so common. So it turned out when we actually do our real model runs about what we think, how we think things might evolve, it's not so important. But I think some of this debate comes from people's intuitions about that social signaling value, and that it is real and it can drop out of the model in certain states.
Yeah, no, super interesting. And I think just to kind of get into some of the other results. Or insights that we might get out of the model. Well, maybe there's a kind of a top line thing, and then we can get into the details. So one top line thing that I took is, again, I'm going to kind of read a sentence, and then we can unpack it a little bit. It goes something like this, or it goes exactly like this. This is the quote. Our parameterized model implies a high likelihood of accelerating emissions reductions over the 21st century, moving the world decisively away from a no policy, business as usual baseline, which I believe as economists speak for, there's hope. And so maybe we just say a little bit about that finding and how you kind of come to it. And then I think we can move into some more details about the relationship of these different outputs and scenarios and so on.
Yeah, so you're right that is really one of the headline conclusions of our whole exercise here, and that so the how we get to that point is we start with this model that has a lot of potential dynamics in it, that can give rise to a lot, there's a lot of potential behavior, and then we do some exercises to try and constrain some of the parameter sets, and that there's two main things. So one is that we use kind of evidence on the current distribution of opinions on climate policy. And so that comes from some Pew surveys, mostly from kind of US, OECD kind of set of countries. And that's a kind of key starting place for our model. And then we also do some exercises where we kind of run the model in kind of, historic mode. So looking at kind of the last decade, and we probabilistically constrain some of the parameters based on how the output from the model matches what actually happened. Mm-hmm. And so that helps us rein in, to some extent, the parameters. And in particular, we're able to do that in parts of the system representing the political component, very importantly in some of the system representing the energy system, and other parts of the model are less well constrained. But we take this probabilistically and then we run the model 100,000 times, sampling over these uncertain kind of parameter spaces. And then we look at what the trajectories of emissions look like under those 100,000 runs. And we find that in a large fraction of them, we see this kind of accelerating climate policy and dropping emissions, so that in our kind of central case, what we call the modal pathway, you get to global net zero emissions. Well, zero emissions, we don't have negative emissions, by about 2080 to 2090. And so that is not a kind of quite a 2-degree consistent pathway, but it's also not far off from it. And so that would get you to something kind of close to above, about 2.3 degrees by 2100.
Yes, and another point that you make in the paper is this is roughly consistent with actually the policy commitments that are kind of on the books that we get out of the Paris Accord and the pledges that have arisen out of that. And then obviously, there's been some talk of maybe adding later out into the century or at some point when we develop the technology, some kind of negative emissions to keep us below 2 degrees. So that's pretty interesting because you didn't plunk in those policies. They actually came out of your model.
Yeah, it was very exciting when we discovered that, because it is quite surprising, right? That, we don't, there's nothing about these policy commitments in our model, right? Because, policy is just arriving as an output from the model. And yet our modal pathway looks very much like what the 2030, 2050 kind of emissions commitments look like. And actually, there was just another paper in Nature last week showing that these long-term net zero commitments that countries have made are largely consistent with a 2-degree pathway. And so that's what we're kind of we seem to be able to capture at least some of those dynamics, whether or not countries are actually going to meet those long-term commitments, we can't say, but our model suggests that they might not be far off from it.
Yeah, no, that is good news, and certainly good news for a model when you can kind of put in the inputs on one side and then you get outputs that actually match something that looks like the real world, which is pretty. I can imagine was pretty exciting. Kind of on the other side, there's always some bad news whenever you do climate modeling, right? There were some model runs where you had higher temperature change popping out, something more closer to 3 to 4 degrees, and it's interesting to, I think, consider the model features that were associated with kind of more or less temperature change. And so I'll just read off some of these that struck me. So in the kind of bad world, what leads to the bad world in some sense is things like, what you write here is high network homophily. So what that means is that people are essentially separated into polarized camps. And so the people who care about climate change and do take efforts to address climate change, that message doesn't spread very effectively through social networks because the social networks are essentially fractured amongst people who think alike. High social norm effects. So people are strongly affected by the people who they're around, but they're around people who they tend to agree with. Political systems that have a bias towards the status quo. couple others that I think is quite interesting. Also, is high biased assimilation. So what this means is that people, and there's some evidence that this is the case, when there are severe weather events or other things like that, people view those things through a partisan lens. So people who believe in climate change, or in the U.S. are Democrats, they'll say, oh, there's wildfires, that's because of climate change. Other people who aren't big fans of the idea of climate change, or consider themselves Republicans, might look at the same thing and say, no, that's because we haven't managed our forests properly. And then the shifting baselines issue, right, which is that's kind of our frog in water example, right, where if we're just comparing temperature to the last 5 to 10 years, it doesn't really look like it's changed all that much, right? Whereas if you look over longer time horizons, then it does look like it's changed quite a bit. And the reality is that humans tend to update their views pretty rapidly. They tend to adapt, which generally is actually probably a good thing about us, but it makes it very difficult for people to see long-term trends. So maybe we could just talk about some of those factors and how they relate to the model to then generate these outcomes of more pessimistic climate scenarios.
Yeah, so kind of broadly speaking, what our model is doing is, it's taking in evidence which is coming from these pure opinion surveys that there is fairly already across the OECD kind of fairly widespread support in general for climate policies, and that's kind of a starting point. And so then you have to kind of, in order to get into these bad states of the world, you have to kind of explain that there needs to be reasons why that doesn't translate into kind of climate policy. And broadly, so there's several reasons why that's the case. So one reason is that there's these kind of social set of reasons, which is you have this fractured social system where, it's that, we're just going to, this distribution of opinion is just going to kind of stick in place. And you're not going to get this what the model would otherwise want to do, which is this kind of broad transmission of support for climate policy as it's spread through the population. There are another set of reasons to do with responsiveness of the political system. And so there's this is, if you have broad support for climate policy, but you have a fairly unresponsive political system where that just doesn't matter in terms of collective action. That's another reason why you could, end up in a world with, not very ambitious climate policy. And then there's another set of reasons to do with the feedback of cognition, right? So even if you're not persuaded by people in your social network, right, there's a pathway in the model where you could just directly observe climate change, right? And so it turns out if you allow that to happen with no kind of limitations on people's cognition, then basically everyone supports climate policy right away because the evidence of climate change, well, not certainly going forward is very, very high. But we know, or we think, that there's probably quite a lot of limits to how people are able to perceive climate change given their observations of weather. And that includes things like shifting baselines, which I've done some work on before using Twitter data, where we suggested that people adjust their sense of normal on about a 5-year basis. And the signal of climate change is not very high on that time frame. And then you couple that with this biased assimilation effect too, and you can get a situation where people are not able to distinguish the climate change signals at all, given their observations. And then there's one final reason for why you might end up in these worst states of the world, and that's to do with the energy system. And if you end up in a world where you just get really unlucky in terms of the evolution of energy technologies, and they just don't keep evolving the way they have, and they stay really expensive. And so even though maybe your climate policy is quite ambitious, it's actually just not doing much in the energy system. That's another reason you can get these draws on the higher end of warming. And so we kind of can distinguish those pathways to some extent by looking at the combination of model parameters that produces different combinations of climate policy and emissions over the 21st century.
Yeah. It's for what it's worth, I'm probably more optimistic about the the technological side than the social side.
Yeah.
I think we have reason to be, in a sense, right? If we just look at the last couple of decades, the technology has come along quite nicely. Our politics have not come along nearly as nicely. I'm curious about some other what you think of some other potential feedback effects, and then I'm curious also if where the future kind of work on this model and this approach is going to take you. So some of the feedbacks that I've written a little bit about in this area are the ways that the climate system or changes in the climate system could kind of do harm to our ability to carry out political change.
Yep.
So I think one of the things that's interesting about the model that you guys have is it's pretty optimistic in the sense that as the climate starts to get, as climate damages become apparent, that generally speaking, through mechanisms that you guys identify, leads people to care more about climate change, which is pretty sensible thing, right? Is that people see something bad happening in the world, they care more about it. The concern that I've raised with a co-author, Peter Howard, is this idea that in order to address climate change, you need to have a fairly high degree of cooperation in society. Because, again, no individual actor, including any individual country, can really substantially change the global emissions pathway. And so there's huge free rider problems, and those aren't going anywhere. There's always going to be free rider problems. And so some form of cooperation is necessary. And the concern is that climate damages undermine the conditions that are necessary for that kind of cooperation, by just putting pressure on societies, mass immigration, economic costs, social dislocation, all the harms that are associated with climate change. Those just decrease the capacity of the state to do, big projects and decrease the ability for international cooperation or the functioning of international institutions. I'm curious whether you guys contemplated that kind of downer of a feedback, and or if it sounds kind of roughly plausible or something that could be potentially incorporated into the model.
Yeah, it's definitely something I was thinking about. I think I definitely think it's true, right? That if you think of what the projects on climate mitigation, like certainly maybe I have my economist hat on, but we would describe it as like providing a global public good, right?
Right.
And that's really hard. And what nation states are more used to is providing like public goods for their citizens, right? Which you might think of that as various types of public adaptation expenditures. Right. And I think like thinking about, we definitely talked about possible models where I think if you had that feedback you would get this kind of bifurcation potentially where you end up in this like negative feedback loop where, you end up in a bad feedback loop, right, which is a reinforcing feedback loop where climate damages lessen the state capacity to undertake mitigation that leads to more climate change damages. I think it's true. I think, the working group and the effort that gave rise to this paper, we were interested in this question of tipping points in the social system, right? So we were tending to, I think, look for examples of reinforcing feedbacks in the like positive direction. Mm-hmm. And I think definitely in a next extension for the model would be to look at some of these more less good examples of tipping points. And I think that is definitely one of them, this idea that you could get trapped in this like constant adaptation, constantly responding to climate change impacts rather than lessening the ability to do these other types of changes. I think the other feedback that we don't have in the model right now is a kind of negative public reaction to changing energy prices. And that's, we know that's true. Like we're seeing it right now. I think, and I would probably incorporate that as some type of, reaction against rapid changes in energy, right? So you can increase energy prices, but if you do it through a carbon tax, but if you do it very quickly, there's a negative response to that, right? That diminishes support for climate policy, and that would, that would change. That would definitely change our results. And so I think some of that, that's all kind of work to be done in as we kind of flesh out some of the richness, I think, of what's in this type of model.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I look forward to future iterations. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned there, which is another really interesting feature of this project, and something that we've kind of returned to on this podcast a few times in the past, which is this is highly interdisciplinary work. And actually, in the paper, you even talk about like there was a 4-day interdisciplinary workshop. That's where we kind of identified the feedbacks that we were interested in, which is very cool, I think, because that's kind of how the real world works. You have these workshops and you get ideas and you exchange, you exchange thoughts, and that's how you kind of, build these things. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that, the workshop, the idea for the workshop, the kinds of folks who were there and what the value was of that.
Mm-hmm. So it came out of this a interdisciplinary working group funded by SSYNC, Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, I want to say, in Annapolis. And it was Brian Beckage and Katie Lacasse and Lou Gross had kind of, who are some of the co-authors in the paper, had been involved in a previous version of the working group, and this was like the second iteration of it. And it's an interesting mixture of disciplines. There's several ecologists. There was some system dynamics specialists. This style of modeling is, often called kind of systems dynamics, like focused on feedback loops and changes over time. And so that's definitely like an important like piece of the modeling. And I think, and then Katie Lacasse is a psychologist. And like there are disciplines missing from that. And so some of that was like us reading a lot into those literatures. But it is, I think it's hard to get these things to always work well. And I think here there was definitely a focus early on quantitative modeling. And so kind of everyone was like on the same page about that, and kind of willing to make the kind of necessary simplifications and so on. That come with trying to put very rich qualitative insights from some of these disciplines into a rather dry computational model in very, very like simple functional forms. But kind of people recognize that was the end goal of this project ultimately. And because of that, we could, kind of came up with some interesting work. I think next, we would like to have more disciplines, in particularly recognizing, I think, political science and law as being really critical to some of these, the way in which, collective action emerges from the space. I think in general, this socioecology modeling, which is this, there's been a lot of that within ecology, right? So ecologists are used to thinking of how do species interact with their environment and how does the environment then shape the species evolution? And like the extension of that then to like humans is a natural one. And so you've seen some of this type of modeling work in kind of coming out of ecologists. And so I think that's, why you see, that's why we have like ecologists involved on this paper. But I think bringing in more of like specialists within the social sciences that are interested in engaging in this type of work, I think it'll like, would be really valuable.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic though what you've done so far just to bring these disciplines together. And again, as you noted, at the end of the day for an exercise like this, stuff has to get translated into quantitative terms that can be put into a model that can generate, that can interact with each other and generate outcomes. And so that can always be a challenge to integrate some of these more qualitative disciplines. Folks can get uncomfortable with making assumptions about like what the coefficient is going to be when you parameterize a model. But I do think that is
not just a coefficient, but I think sometimes people can get very hung up on the terminology, and you get into debates about what I would call like semantic debates that are not particularly substantive. Because, semantics are important in some of these disciplines. But when you start translating these ideas into numbers, like a lot of it, really these nuances, these distinctions start breaking down. And you have to be willing to like let go of some of that and kind of, recognize that, what you call this and what I call this are, really when we actually try and like put it into a model like that's a kind of functioning as the same thing. And we just have to like live with that and like let go of some of these more semantic distinctions.
Right.
And that, it takes a certain kind of flexibility of mindset, I think, for people to be able to do that.
Yeah, but that's also a useful intellectual exercise in its own, is to, when we kind of nail this out and say, actually, we're talking about the same thing.
Yep. Yeah,
when
exactly.
it comes down to it. That actually takes us back, I think, a little bit to that point that I made earlier about the different kind of philosophical underpinnings of these different approaches. Because, you mentioned, kind of ecology and the way that, we could think of, ecosystems and species and ecosystems just kind of all interacting with each other within a single kind of model. And there's no reason in principle not to think about, well, at least in one worldview, there's no reason in principle not to just think of humans exactly the same way, that we're conditioned by our environment. We then interact with our environment and have effects on that environment, and that feeds back to us. And it's kind of what you have is almost like a fully causal model of the human climate system. Now, again, as you note, it's not like comprehensive and complete and whatever else. I mean, you're making a rough cut and an attempt to include what you think are the important features. But broadly speaking, the underlying idea is that, we're acted on by causal forces. We have characteristics that then, can change over time or not. But, that we're kind of embedded in this dynamic, essentially, that is kind of fully enclosed from a causal perspective. Whereas under like the Nordhaus model, what you might say, one way to interpret that is, we have a choice. There's no social decision maker in reality, but we ask this question, which is, if I were a social decision maker, what would be the right thing to do? It's kind of a utilitarian worldview that says, well, this is really what social decision makers, or the people who are best positioned to make social policy, ought to do, because it maximizes, social welfare, social well-being. And then you could think of the IPCC world as being a little bit more agnostic in terms of the ethical framework that it's using, right? It's not clear that they're trying to maximize social welfare. It's not really clear what their utility function is exactly, but basically they're saying we have a choice. We can choose emissions pathway A, B, C, or D. What kind of world do we want to live in? And we have to decide that collectively. I think it's very interesting. So I guess I would just be curious about your thoughts. Is that something that you all considered when thinking about your model and how it differed from the other models, or was this, is this a little bit of a philosopher's point that wasn't really front of mind?
No, it's definitely something. I think your typology is exactly accurate there, and it's definitely something that certainly I was thinking about. And in particular, it came up when I was kind of communicating about this paper. I was talking to people about it, and people would say, well, what does it mean about what we can do? And it's like, well, it's kind of not that type of model.
Right.
It's very much a descriptive, not a normative model, right? It's telling you like, well, if this is, the type of world we live in, then this is what, emissions are likely to be. And if this is the type of world we live in, then this is what emissions are likely to be. And in that sense, it is very, like, the goal of the modeling exercise is understanding and descriptive primarily, and not necessarily prescriptive or normative kind of in its intent. And that makes it different, I think, than some of these, the goals of these other modeling exercises that do see their role as kind of giving advice, say, to some imagined decision maker. But, the problem is that like this global decision maker kind of doesn't exist for these complex, wicked problems, like climate change is one example. And I think it does, in that sense, what this is doing is pointing to the importance of, like, if you take the science of sustainability and the science of social ecological systems seriously, then the driving, like, determinant of how these natural systems evolve over the 21st century is going to be people, like people's collective decisions. And you need, like, you can't just exclude that from your understanding of the system. Like, you're kind of like taking the most important driver and you're just explicitly saying, oh no, we don't do that. We don't model that. And to me, that's just very unsatisfying as a scientific exercise. And I think there is echoes. I would say there's echoes here of work like Eleanor Ostrom, in the sense that, she studied scientifically the emergence of like behaviors that, kind of these collective decisions around common pool resource management, right? And, a lot of her work was looking at, under what situations do you see this arise and under what situations do you not? And it was this descriptive exercise. And she tended to be quite averse to saying, like, oh, well, here's what we can do to manage this type of resource better. Her work tended not to be particularly prescriptive in that sense. And I think you can see this in the same vein, in the sense of like, what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand and predict and project the emergence of collective action around, governance of various types of environmental commons, in order to better understand both the processes that give rise to that type of governance, as well as the behavior of of what the trajectory of those systems will look like over time.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. An interesting connection to Ostrom's work, because that does make a lot of sense. One feedback that just occurred to me that maybe you could include in future iterations is the feedback effect of your model into the policy process. Right? Is that now it's out? It's people can see it, and then if people change their behavior on the basis of your paper, that itself is a kind of feedback effect. Yeah. Maybe a little hard to incorporate into the model, but kind of fun to contemplate. Mm-hmm. So one maybe final question for you is, again, with this predictive enterprise and kind of with the state of modeling, obviously you're not saying we know what the world's going to look like, right? You're saying, look, there's some probability distributions, and we think these are some of the important features of the world that will bear on whether we find ourselves at 2 degrees or 3 degrees or 3.5 degrees. By the century's end. And so, again, as someone who's been in the weeds of the model and seen the runs and done the analysis, one of the things I would be very interested to hear from you is, what are the things that we should be looking for over the next 10 years? Like, what are the features of the social world or the technological world that we want to know about? That if X, if we observe X, then this should give us hope that we are going to stay within a reasonable temperature change. Or if we see Y, then it's time to move to Canada. What are the things that we should be looking for? Is it the next midterm elections, or is it is it like something in terms of if political polarization continues along the same track? Like, what are the things? Is it just public opinion? Yeah, what are the things that we should be looking for over the next 5 to 10 years that will be a signal about what world we're most likely to find ourselves in?
Yeah, I think I'm probably going to reveal my economist background here, and I would say probably something along the lines of carbon pricing, because one of the common features, near-term features of these worlds that look more optimistic is you see quite rapid increase in the stringency of climate policy, where that's measured in terms of some kind of aggregate carbon pricing measure. And I think if you, kind of over the next few years, if, we're starting to see that, like the, European carbon price is going up rapidly, same in California, and so, but it's not just carbon pricing, right? It's also, to the extent we have more ambitious, non-pricing climate goals like renewable portfolio standards or other types of, say, efficiency regulations that are binding at a certain cost, right? That's kind of all rolled into that measure of the kind of equivalent, the carbon tax equivalent. And so I think if you and this is globally, right? So I think Americans tend to concentrate very much on like what's happening at the federal level in the U.S., but we should recognize that emissions in the U.S. and not unrelated to what happens like everywhere else, because there are these spillover effects via markets and technology spillovers and things like that. And so yeah, I would definitely be keeping an eye on that over the next 10 or so years, I guess, to see to what extent our our model projections are kind of being borne out.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, in a way, that we could probably just keep our eye on emissions. Then is that under the more optimistic scenario.
Well, that has a slower response, right? And that also depends more on you have this question about what emissions technologies do over time. But I think you can really distinguish, are you in this set of more positive type social political system world or not, based on what happens to the carbon price in the fairly near term.
Okay, well. All the more reason for us to hope for a stringent carbon price. Not only will it actually generate the outcome, but it will predict that we'll be in a good world as well. So, okay, well, very good. Fran, thanks so much for chatting with me today. This was a super fun and informative conversation.
Thank you so much for the great questions.